Great. So hi Mark, thanks ever so much for joining us today in these climate conversations. It'd be great if you could introduce yourself and your kind of roles.
Yeah, so I'm Mark Parsons. I am part of Studio Polpo, which is a social enterprise arts, architecture and research practice in Sheffield. And I've also taught in the School of Architecture at University of Sheffield for quite a long time in different years. And I'm a dad and general citizen.
Thank you. So it would be great if you could begin by just telling everyone a little bit about what you're working on in relation to climate change right now.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, you could say everything we work on, or everything that everyone works on, has something to do with climate change to some degree. And some projects that we're working on are more specifically aimed at educating or working with certain aspects of tackling climate change, and some because they're just building projects, and building projects all tend to contribute to global heating or climate change in some way, that we're trying to make that as least bad as possible. So I suppose the examples there might be looking at sort of very simple domestic house extensions and trying to use as many biomaterials and waste materials as possible while still getting through building regs. And, you know, that's the kind of the small end of the scale, I suppose, and stepping up to things like a small music studio project we're working on, which is trying to use, or trying to not have foundations and use screw piles and use all kind of wood-based materials. So I suppose they're the more normal architectural projects where within that kind of maybe slightly limited budget, more normal project, we're trying to address things around embodied carbon and energy reuse. And then I suppose there's a few projects which are more, I guess, unusual, which are looking at, can we grow materials? We've been working with mycelium on a few projects, and we've been doing quite a few projects with schools. So I think, you know, that overlaps a little bit with architectural education maybe, but saying, how do we educate people and show them lots of different ideas and make it a kind of very positive routes to making things better, rather than why everything is bad and why we have to stop doing certain things. I think, you know, personally, I'm less inclined to be someone who's kind of brave and protest things, but I'm more about kind of creative responses and optimism and bringing people along, really. I think, you know, you need all of those types of people. But so I think the education things have been around, you know, the working with mycelium has been particularly fascinating, particularly working with schools where we've got all these cycles of things that will grow off what is seen as waste material, like cardboard. They'll actually produce edible things like mushrooms that you can eat, and then they'll be left with a kind of a product, I suppose, that is usable, and it's not something you have to buy. You can grow it and you can make it. So, you know, having tested it ourselves and then working with the kids, making this a very sort of open experimental process. And I think that's been really nice, because the conversations that have come out of that have been, oh, we could use it for this, or we could use mycelium for all sorts of different things. And, you know, that's quite exciting, because you then think, well, maybe in a few years, you know, maybe these are primary school kids, they're doing kind of GCSEs, A levels. They've suddenly got an awareness of different ways of doing things. We're working with some schools in London as well at the moment on designing a pavilion with kind of reclaimed materials and waste, which has been really interesting, of them kind of harvest mapping and looking at resources and waste. And that's something we, again, try and do as a practice. But what's been nice there has been working with these 3 different schools, a primary school, a secondary school, and a special educational needs school, to actually work together. So they'll never be in the same space, but there's a co-design process where we're sharing what one group has done with the other group. We have to sort of mediate it, but this thing of you know, maybe that there's a kind of collective inquiry is exciting and is interesting, and is maybe something we could do more, and talk to different people that you don't think you have anything in common with, to kind of come up with an outcome. I think that's interesting. And so it's kind of not it's not a kind of well, it is a kind of carbon and waste material thing, but I think the kind of collective approach to it is particularly interesting, because maybe that's not talked enough about, I suppose, in responses to climate emergency, and actually talking about this in forums, but discussing it and thinking about what we can do and why things might be a problem, you know, is just as critical as being able to calculate what's gone into things. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, all of our projects and all projects have something to do with climate emergency, don't they? And there's some which are more specifically around low carbon materials, as much as we can. Some are more kind of out there, and then some are more how you talk to people around this subject and how you get them engaged in it.
Thank you. That's great. And you started to say this a little bit already, but I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how you do this kind of work, in particular kind of the materials or spaces that you might use, or kind of who you work with and what those processes are.
Well, I guess on the more architectural projects, those ones have been people in a traditional way that will come to us as a practice, and then I think we're trying to then bring clients and users on board in making it as low carbon and sort of environmental as possible. So there's a kind of, they're coming to us for a space, and then we're trying to influence as much as possible how that space is, how the materials are used, for example. I think all the other ones are, on the whole, they're things initiated by us as a practice. So we're saying, well, there should be more of this, there should be these types of projects, how can we make them happen? So the mycelium one with the school, for example, is an Arts Council bid, which we've done, sort of linked to another project, but we've applied for funding 3 times till we got it, but because we thought it was a good idea, and we got there in the end. And then we've had to bring in all the different people to make that happen. So we've approached the school, we've worked with the British Mycological Society, who are very kind of science end of things. The school are all the local kids that are next to where this pavilion is being made. We're working with a sawmill near Hillsborough and Sheffield to source green timber for this structure. We've been trawling around bins looking for kind of cardboard boxes and things. So I think, it's very much, maybe it's quite unusual, but it's trying to see how something might work, and then fishing around for all the elements to bring together and writing that in as a bid. I mean, I think I mentioned it's part of a bigger project, and I think that's an interesting one, because that is working with a theatre company and Healy Development Trust. So again, quite central to Sheffield. And there'll be numerous partners and lots more bids in that. So there's local people who've lived there, some of them probably 80 years, and they've got a lot of expertise in living in that area. There's Munich University, who we're working with, they have an architecture and landscape specialism, so engineering around living tree structures. So there's a kind of very scientific knowledge. There's hedge layers with kind of historical hedge laying techniques. Theatre performers, and then there's a kind of overarching, I suppose, community organisation, the Healy Development Trust, which have been working with various groups in their area, stewarding that part of Healy, and will be managing anything that gets kind of designed and built there. So it's very interesting that there are lots of different people in these kind of bids, and people will all benefit in different ways, but all from each other as well, I think. So some people will benefit from more research, essentially, and a place to test stuff. Some people will benefit because it will create places for them to use that are outdoors, that are around performance. And there's a kind of sharing of knowledge between all these people, which is always quite exciting in these projects. And I think it's not kind of necessarily different voices or different viewpoints, but just coming at things from a really different background, which is what we found with the kind of fungus guys. They have a very specific scientific background, but they are often very sort of delighted to see things around arts and creativity that are using kind of fungus or mycelium, and kind of vice versa. The artists and people that we work with are really fascinated by the scientific aspects of things. And I think it's kind of nice to make all these processes really visible, because people, do find a way into new things. So the projects really happen, and the people involved are very wide ranging. Often it's us just saying, wouldn't it be great if we could bring all these kind of slightly siloed individuals together? And within universities or large organizations, all those people are often in one organization, but they don't really have time or mechanisms to work together until someone external goes, oh, we're going to do this, and can you join in because you know about this? Can you join in because you know about this? And then something kind of quite interesting happens. But it is kind of very rewarding, but quite a kind of difficult process, I guess.
Thank you. That's really interesting. The final question for you is, and it's a really big and difficult one, I'm aware, but maybe just some thoughts for something that kind of you're thinking about right now. What's the biggest kind of issue around climate change for Sheffield, would you say, at the moment?
On a bit of a niche thing, I think there seems to be a lack of regulatory power in the city to control the nature of new development. And I think, there's a lot of building going on in Sheffield city centre. There's a lot of housing, lots of student housing, and it's kind of quite sort of okay, but it seems to be building stock that will need kind of a retrofit in maybe 5 or 10 years if we're going to be serious about making kind of interesting and healthy and low carbon places to live. And I think seems to be, on the one hand, there's kind of a good push from local authority around greening spaces and cycle networks, and it's a kind of slow process, but that's kind of visible in terms of kind of aspirational and actually sort of positive kind of building development that is climate sensitive and works well. That doesn't seem to be there at all, and if people kind of get over the sort of minimum thresholds and some basic regulations, that's kind of what they're aiming for. And so I think there has to be, people aren't really going to do it themselves on the whole in terms of developers. And I think it'd be really interesting if there was some mechanism where the people of the city, and in particular kind of universities, could more directly influence and advise on what might happen in terms of policy. So there are real kind of regulatory teeth to sort of force developers to do things in the absence of them wanting to do it themselves. Now, sometimes it happens from the developer side because there's a financial benefit to being able to offer something that is better performing environmentally, but it's kind of often the minimum. And I think that's a real shame. So I think although there are lots of groups doing things and they're often doing things in parallel, and there's lots of networks in the centre of Sheffield because it's kind of a very small, dense centre, I think the stuff that's being built makes on an urban scale kind of works quite well, but it's not really fit for purpose, isn't it? And there's a lot of it, and I think it's something that the planning authority feel a bit powerless about, as far as I'm aware. So I think ways of other organisations supporting them or working together or putting pressure on sort of developers somehow, I think is a key thing to look at.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Thanks ever so much.